Right, welcome everyone to the last of our series of deep dives on Draft Aotearoa New Zealand Climate Standards. Co-Amelia Sharma Tokuingawa, Director Sustainability Reporting, and joining me today in order of appearance are Lisa Kelsey, Jack Bissett, Judy Ryan, and Steph Gray. So the intent of this deep dive is to clearly explain the proposed disclosure requirements in the exposure drafts so that you can provide us with informed comments and feedback about any areas that you consider need further attention by the Xrb board. So as I'm assuming you all know, the Xrb is proposing that the climate-related disclosure framework, as enabled by legislation, is made up of 3 climate standards, which are collectively referred to as Aotearoa New Zealand Climate Standards. Each draft standard is a piece of secondary legislation, and we would like to emphasise the importance of the standards being read together as a package. Today's deep dive is focused on the exposure drafts of Nz Cs2 and Nz Cs2, paying particular attention to examples and issues relevant for MIS managers. And why have we done a separate session for MIS managers? Large managers of registered managed investment schemes, MIS managers, are climate reporting entities. And this is under Section 461S of the Financial Sector Climate-Related Disclosures and Other Matters Amendment Act 2021. It's important that MIS managers read that Section 461S for the meaning of large managers, as authorised bodies are also captured as large managers. The legislation requires, under Section 461ZC, that MIS managers make climate-related disclosures in respect of the scheme. This means for MIS managers, the process of disclosure will be somewhat different than it is for other climate reporting entities disclosing under Nz Cs1. So while others must disclose the impacts of climate change on themselves as an entity, MIS managers disclose in respect of the registered investment scheme under their management scheme or schemes. However, and as we note in the staff guidance, we do consider that approaching the process of climate-related risk and opportunity analysis and disclosure solely from this narrower perspective may prove challenging. Globally, asset managers, so MIS managers here in New Zealand, have tended to approach disclosure in a more holistic manner. And this has involved referring to their own corporate governance, strategies, risk management, and metrics and targets as appropriate, alongside references to the climate-related risks and opportunities of material importance to their investment portfolios. So what this means in practical terms for you is that sources of guidance available globally have been designed with this model in mind, making them difficult for MIS managers and us here at the Xrb to readily interpret and apply in a New Zealand context. However, we have done our best and we're really keen to get your feedback on the guidance, which we'll get to later on in the deep dive. I would also note that in the context of fair presentation, it's also important to note that primary users may consider information on the MIS manager as an entity to be material, such as, for example, an entity strategy that flows through to its fund management decisions, and thus it would be required to be disclosed. If you want to know more about a fair presentation and materiality, etc., please do rewatch the deep dive that we had on Nz Cs3, and I'll talk about that a bit more in the next slide. So that's it for the intro. In terms of questions, we'll address questions at intervals throughout the presentation, so please do use the Q&A function to get your questions in, and please do get them in early so we can make sure we get to them. If we're deluged with questions and we don't get to your question today, we will respond to it after the event. And as I said, we've run the 3 previous deep dives. If you missed any of these, you want to rewatch them, we have recordings available on our website. And then before we get into the specifics, I'm going to cover the objective, scope, and effective date of draft Nz Cs1. So, in providing a consistent framework for entities to consider the climate-related risks and climate-related opportunities that climate change presents for their activities over the short, medium, and long term, the objective of Nz Cs1 is to enable primary users to assess the merits of how entities are considering those risks and opportunities and make decisions based on these assessments. The ultimate aim is to support the allocation of capital towards activities that are consistent with a transition to a low emissions, climate resilient future. The scope section of the standard sets out which entities a standard applies to. Nz Cs1 applies to those entities which are required by the Financial Markets Conduct Act 2013 to prepare climate statements or group climate statements that comply with the climate-related disclosure framework. Now, the Xrb board can issue standards that apply to interim periods. For the avoidance of any doubt, the Xrb board has clarified in paragraph 4 that Nz Cs2 does not apply to interim periods. And any entity that elects to voluntarily or is otherwise directed to prepare climate-related disclosures is encouraged to apply all the requirements of Aotearoa New Zealand Climate Standards. Appendix B sets out the effective date of the standard, and the proposed effective date of Nz Cs2 is annual reporting periods beginning on or after 1 January 2023. So if you have a March balance date, your first climate-related disclosures will be for the year ended 31 March 2024. If you have a June balance date, then your first climate-related disclosures will be for the year ended 30 June 2024. In today's deep dive, we're going to run through the 4 sections: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics and target, and also assurance of greenhouse gas emissions of Nz Cs2 with you. But before we get started on those 4 sections, I'm going to hand over to Lisa to provide a quick overview of Nz Cs2.
Thanks, Amelia. So we'll just have a little look at draft Nz Cs2. So the Xrb board is proposing mostly 1-year exemptions across 3 topics: strategy, metrics and targets, and an Nz Cs3 comparative information. These are areas where it either makes logical sense for entities to be given exemptions, such as comparatives and analysis of trends, or which represent more complicated areas for disclosure, such as Scope 3 GHG emissions. The way the first-time adoption standard works is that an entity elects to use one or more of the adoption provisions contained in the draft standard. Paragraph 25 of Nz Cs2 requires that if an entity elects to use any of the first-time adoption provisions, it must include a description of those adoption provisions used in conjunction with its statement of compliance. As the title of the standard suggests, these provisions are available to an entity the first time it adopts Aotearoa New Zealand Climate Standards. So these adoption provisions are available to those 200 odd entities who are currently captured by the regime. But if at any point an entity becomes a climate reporting entity, by virtue of the fact it meets the criteria in the Act, as a first-time adopter, that entity may apply the first-time adoption provisions. However, it is important to note that if an entity drops out of the regime, only to re-enter a few years later, the Xrb board's view is that the entity should not be able to take advantage of those first-time adoption provisions again. And this is set out in paragraph 4 of the draft standard. As we work through the proposed requirements in Nz Cs2 today, we will identify which disclosures have first-time adoption provisions. We'll use the smiley face icon you see on this slide. Just a couple of other things before we get into Nz Cs2. We have, as we previously communicated, the proposed disclosures are based on the TCFD recommendations and have been informed by the exposure drafts issued by the International Sustainability Standards Board. Today, we're not going to discuss how each of the Xrb proposed requirements align with the TCFD or the ISSB. However, we have prepared comparison tables both to the TCFD and the ISSB, and these are available on our website. I'd also like to point out that each standard is accompanied by what is known as a basis for conclusions. These will be familiar with those who use accounting and auditing and assurance standards, but for those new to standards, the basis for conclusion is intended to provide useful explanations of the Xrb's decision-making process during the standards development, and we would encourage you to read these. Nz Cs3, draft Nz Cs3 has general requirements and principles, and I'd just like to draw your attention to one requirement in there. So section 461 ZC, I'm just going to say of the legislation, but that is the Long Amendment Act, sets out requirements in terms of reporting at a fund-by-fund level. To avoid unnecessarily duplication, draft Nz Cs3 allows for common information to be presented at a scheme level For example, if the disclosures on governance and risk management contain common information for each fund within a scheme, these may be presented at a scheme level. And this is set out in paragraph 19 of draft Nz Cs2. And we added this clarification following feedback received from our earlier consultation. Right, we're now going to work through the contents of the 4 sections in Nz Cs1. The 4 sections in Nz Cs1 follow a consistent format. Each section contains a disclosure objective, overarching disclosures, followed by sub-disclosures where needed. First up, the proposed governance disclosures. We consulted on these in October 2021. The main changes to the governance disclosures between that first consultation round and the ED are summarised on page 16 of the consultation document. I will highlight these changes as we work through the governance disclosures. The objective of the governance disclosures is to enable primary users to understand both the role an entity's governance body plays in overseeing climate-related risks and opportunities, and the role management plays in assessing and managing those climate-related risks and opportunities. Such information supports evaluations of whether climate-related risks and opportunities receive appropriate attention from the governance body and management. For our MIS manager, governance focuses on the management of the schemes to which the disclosures apply, rather than the entity as a whole, and Amelia covered that off earlier. The quality of governance structures and functions are primary factors in determining whether an entity can successfully identify, analyse, and manage its climate-related risks and opportunities. The governance section has 3 overarching disclosures, 2 of which contain sub-disclosures. Following feedback from the first round of consultation, the Xrb board agreed with respondents that we should use a more generic term, and hence we have moved away from the TCFD language of board to the more general term of governance body. We also added a disclosure, as you can see on the slide, of the identity of the governance body responsible for climate-related risks and opportunity. This disclosure enables an entity to describe the body with the ultimate responsibility for climate-related risks and opportunities. Where an MIS manager has their investment strategies and operational rules of the scheme determined by an investment committee, this committee may fulfil the role of a governance body responsible for oversight of climate-related risks and opportunities. However, each MIS manager will need to determine which body best meets this description under their specific facts and circumstances. There are 4 sub-disclosures for the governance body oversight, and we'll just quickly run through those. First up, the processes and frequency by which the governance body is informed about climate-related risks and opportunities. This is unchanged from the earlier consultation and allows an entity to describe the channels and frequency of communication between management and the governing body. Next one is the appropriate skills and competencies. So in our October consultation, we had a disclosure that focused mainly on how the governance body accessed expertise. We had feedback that from, and in particular investor bodies that wanted the Xrb to strengthen this disclosure. So we are now proposing the disclosure on the slide, which is how the body ensures the appropriate skills and competencies are available to provide oversight. And we see that in the early years of the regime, this disclosure may simply reflect an entity's process of the capacity building and the development of competencies that had previously not been a focal area. Then moving on to how the body considers climate-related risks when overseeing implementation of strategy. So for this proposed disclosure provides the MIS manager with the opportunity to demonstrate the coherence of their investment committees, if that's the body, to incorporate climate-related risks and opportunities in the development of their investment strategy, and in bringing that strategy to fruition via the structures and philosophies adopted in the management of the schemes and the investment decisions arrived at. And then lastly, it is how the governance body monitors progress. So this last one is an amalgamation of our earlier disclosures. And we've clarified that the disclosure of performance metrics is a whether and if so, how disclosure. And then under the management's role, there's also sub-disclosures under that overarching requirement. And these focus on who and how of climate-related risks and opportunities management, where the delegated responsibilities lie, and how often management is involved. That's a short run through of the governance. Amelia, I don't know if we have any questions at this stage.
Thank you, Lisa, and sorry for my very fast run through of the slides there. Had a bit of a mouse accident. Sure, we have a question which says the mapping tables to TCFD and ISSB are very interesting and useful. So thank you for that feedback. Why is there no comparison to the advanced/ambitious EU Sfdr standards? The short answer is because we are a small team and we could provide comparisons to all sorts of things like the US SEC proposals to the proposals of the UK. We focused on the TCFD because that is the source material for the standards, and the ISSB because that is the new international body. So basically the answer is limited time. We've been very interested in what's happening in all the other jurisdictions, EU, US, etc. But that is why we only did those.
It's also not a climate standard, it's a broad sustainability standard. So the sense would be a little difficult there.
Thank you. And that might answer the second question on that, which is broadly speaking, how does the standard relate to the EU Sfdr? So in terms of relate, it has the standard here in New Zealand applies to climate reporting entities here in New Zealand. There's no overlapping requirements. We're just, we're very interested in what's happening in Europe, and we are keeping an eye on it. But we're, equally interested in what is happening at the ISSB level. That is significantly important for New Zealand. Okay, one question, very specific question. Now, I'm going to read out this question, and we might be able to answer it in a kind of general capacity, which is the FMA's website states that climate reporting entities are all managers of registered investment schemes other than restricted schemes with greater than 1 billion in total assets under management. FMA's website also states that KiwiSaver is a restricted scheme. Does this mean if I manage KiwiSaver funds only, even if my total assets under management are greater than $1 billion, I will not be captured by CRD? Okay, so I think we'll answer that question in the broad sense, which is we cannot provide advice here at the Xrb about whether or not you are a climate reporting entity. As you've noted, the FMA's website's recently been updated. There's some really brilliant flowcharts on there which help provide guidance as to whether or not an entity is a climate reporting entity. But those flowcharts also have very important disclaimers on them, which you must seek independent legal advice. Whether or not your scheme is in or out, we really recommend that you do seek that legal advice. And if there is any uncertainty remaining after you got that independent legal advice, you then obviously can go talk to the FMA. But in general, we've got another question: are KiwiSaver schemes not captured by climate related disclosures? Absolutely, KiwiSaver schemes are captured by climate related disclosures. If a KiwiSaver scheme meets that definition in the legislation, then it is captured. So absolutely, we would encourage you to get independent legal advice, but it is not, the Xrb cannot tell you whether or not you are a climate reporting entity or not. We've got another question, Lisa, specifically on governance, which says, if oversight is spread across more than one governance body, i.e. an investment committee and the entity's board, presumably we would need to disclose details of both?
Yes. Yeah, so if your ultimate body is the entity's board, then I would definitely be disclosing that structure and how that works to your primary user. Yes.
Thank you. And we've got one other question, which is more specific around risk, which I will save, and we will ask that one in one of the next sections. So that's everything for governance now, Lisa. Thank you very much. Okay, so now over to Jack to take us through the proposed strategy disclosures.
Thanks, Amelia. Kia ora koutou. This section of the presentation, this outlines our proposed strategy disclosures, and these follow feedback we've received during the last round of consultation. So thanks to everyone who provided us with feedback. So this section, fundamentally, it's about your investment strategy and the relevant business model. So it's about what you're trying to achieve and how. So it's not about having a separate climate strategy over in the corner. It's about answering for your primary users, how will climate change impact you, and how you positioning your investment strategy and business model in anticipation of transformational changes to the world around you. So I'll work through the high-level structure of the strategy section before we get deeper into each of the areas of sub-disclosures. So this is the objective of the strategy section that we're currently proposing and consulting on. And as you can see, this requires you to cover quite a broad range of issues and reflecting what we consider to be quite rapidly rising expectations in this area of what comes under the strategy section. So we do acknowledge that there's a lot in here, and that's reflected in why we've offered first-time adoption provisions for some of the disclosures themselves. So here, the expectation is to be covering basically a demonstration that you understand the risks and opportunities that you're exposed to, the scenario analysis undertaken, the current and anticipated impacts of climate change and financial impacts, and the transition plan aspects of your strategy. So this green highlight just demonstrating where the key changes have happened to this sort of structure of the strategy section. So we have this new structural component on the far right, how the entity will position itself, which creates the fourth high-level disclosure, and that's where the transition plan aspects of the strategy are contained. Then we've done some reordering on the left to better reflect the process that climate reporting entities go through, and also influenced by the structure of the ISSB's proposed strategy section. So those are the sort of four pillars, and moving into the first one on current impacts and financial impacts. So basically this area is really getting at less of this forward-looking nature and more like the here and now when it comes to climate change. So how's climate change currently affecting you and your scheme is effectively what primary users are looking for information on. And this is because, we already live in a world that includes 1.1 degrees of warming. We're already seeing significant and ongoing extreme weather events around the globe. We're seeing changing societal and political factors already. And therefore, primary users want evidence that you are getting on top of this and starting to understand how this is already impacting your scheme, and also most recently reported financial position and performance. And so just to capture the essence of this, quote from the IPCC is that it's unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean and land. Widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere and biosphere have occurred. So for instance, you may have been forced to alter your priorities, doing things like engaging with us on climate-related disclosure requirements, or be adjusting your perspective on the prospects of certain asset classes, sectors or jurisdictions. Cross-industry metrics that Judy will touch on later, these provide a useful starting point in identifying these financial impacts. So we are suggesting here, and we're suggesting this across the standard more broadly, that you begin qualitatively and build in quantification over time. So in this instance, quantification is likely to be a range, and in many cases a broad range subject to high levels of uncertainty. We have proposed a one-year first-time adoption provision for the financial impact aspects of this disclosure requirement, if you want to take up the option. And for some of the impacts and current impacts, you may consider that you cannot precisely quantify them. And in that case, you can make use of this third disclosure and disclose qualitative information coupled with an explanation as to why you couldn't quantify. Compared to last time, we've amended some of the language in here. So for example, the terms actual and potential have gone, and now we're proposing current and anticipated, aligning with the ISSB, and also some of the underlying definitions have also been relaxed. Okay, moving on now to the second area, which is scenario analysis. So here primary users are interested in understanding the scenario analysis process you have followed and what the core assumptions underpinning the analysis were and whether they align with those being used by peers within your sector and other sectors. So we're proposing scenario analysis disclosure requirements that cover at least 3 scenarios. So 1.5 degrees climate related scenario, a 3 degrees or greater, and a third scenario where you can choose the temperature outcome. So following feedback, we have increased the minimum number of climate related scenarios up from 2 to 3. And we've also increased the upper bound temperature outcome from greater than 2 degrees to greater than 3 degrees. And that was in response to concerns that we heard during feedback that greater than 2 degrees is insufficiently high and would mean that entities wouldn't necessarily be exploring high enough physical risk scenarios. And also that if we only required the use of 2 scenarios, that then these would become the kind of polar opposites of a good and bad scenario when all of the scenarios are supposed to be plausible climate futures that we're uncertain as to which will play out. We are not proposing any first-time adoption provisions for scenario analysis, even though we did have some feedback asking for this. We did consider this carefully, but we consider that scenario analysis can be conducted by entities effectively immediately, and there's no requirement to quantify the outcomes of scenarios using complex quantitative modelling. It is first and foremost a tool of strategic thinking, and we believe that all entities are capable of doing that. We have published guidance on how to get started on scenario analysis at the sector level and a fact sheet which clarifies the definition and purpose of scenario analysis under this framework, and both of those are available on our website. So getting a little deeper into the swimming pool now. So as I touched on, scenario analysis is a process for systematically exploring the effects of a range of plausible future events under conditions of uncertainty. And the primary purpose of scenario analysis in this context is to be testing the resilience of your investment strategy and the associated business model to these multiple different scenarios. So given we do not know which scenario we'll face, this means an entity can begin to think about how to build resilience to the prospect that any one of these scenarios could play out. And in doing that, climate-related risks and opportunities are typically identified, which then feeds into the wider disclosure process. So this is why we see it as an important, quite foundational aspect of the broader disclosure regime. So earlier this year, we reached out to engage with all sectors that fall within the scope of the regime to encourage them to basically get started on scenario analysis at a sector level. So many sectors are already doing so, with further sectors continuing to come online with collaborative projects, and we are very much excited about those developments. So we do encourage you to stay across what's happening in your sector if you're not already. And the reason that we've done this is basically because, the translation of high-level information about global patterns of change, so right up the top left of this diagram, down to an individual entity or scheme level, is quite a lot of work, and it is quite a lot to take that global information and boil it down to a scheme. And we think that sectoral collaboration can help to ensure that that translation is done in a more consistent way and more efficiently than all MIS managers doing this separately and individually. So we are effectively trying to help MIS managers to avoid this situation on the left and move more towards the situation on the right-hand side, which we believe will result in more consistent and comparable disclosures within, looking basically across schemes and funds, and then also with the rest of the economy and the corporate side, who are also undertaking scenario analysis as part of this regime. This sector level scenario analysis is not mandatory by any stretch. It is something we're just recommending through effectively outreach as a way to help you meet the standard, but certainly is not mandatory to do so. Okay, so getting into a few examples now of basically individual scenario analysis type disclosures and moving that from that sector level down to the entity level. So just to quickly start with a disclaimer. So, we'll show a few examples of disclosures in this presentation today. These are all made under a voluntary regime. None of them have had Nz Cs2 in mind in the proposals we've been developing here in New Zealand. So we're only using these examples to basically communicate a pretty specific point, and we haven't reviewed or endorsed the rest of the disclosures that these entities have made. So here we have PIMCO. So they've effectively, developed a model, in this case, to estimate the impacts of physical and transition risk exposure of their holdings down to the sector and regional levels. So they have the orderly, disorderly, hothouse, NGFS type assumptions there across those different index funds. So just to jump back to sector level scenario analysis, this is effectively the broad picture of where we understand all the different sectors in the regime are at. And so we're aware that the MIS managers have been collaborating and getting started in this area. So if you're not aware of that work that's being coordinated by the FSC and Boutique Investment Group and others, then we would suggest starting with them, or reach out to us and we can help you to join any conversations that you want to be connected to. So as you can see, quite a lot, particularly across the corporate sector, and we're hoping that this collaboration helps everyone to make sense of what others are doing in this area, because it is a new field and a new type of analysis that certainly is new to most. Okay, moving on now to climate-related risks and opportunities themselves, which is a disclosure that sits in the strategy section as the third pillar. So this is a core piece of information that your primary users are looking for. So effectively, the disclosure requirements are to disclose the risks and opportunities themselves, but also the sub-disclosures, which give further detail in terms of the how you've defined short, medium, and long-term time horizons, how those link to strategic planning and investment processes. Also, when you anticipate that the financial impacts will arise in relation to these risks and opportunities, and a description of how risks and opportunities serve as an input into financial planning processes for capital deployment and funding. So again here, we have the first time adoption provision available for the financial impact aspects of this disclosure. Okay, so hopefully everybody's getting quite familiar now with these terms, physical risks and opportunities, and transition risks and opportunities on the right. But for maybe some who are not fully familiar with them, just to go over it again. So physical risks and opportunities, these arise due to the physical impacts of climate change. So these can be acute, more event-driven, such as increased severity of extreme weather events, and then they can be also chronic or longer-term shifts. So things like changes in precipitation, temperature, increased variability in weather patterns. Transition risks and opportunities on the right-hand side there, these arise due to the transition to a lower emissions, climate resilient, global and domestic economy. So these are things like the policy and legal risks, technology risks, market and reputational risks. We have updated the definitions in the standard, so the definition of transition risks in particular, to clarify that basically transition includes this idea of both mitigation and adaptation. So we're transitioning to a lower emissions, climate resilient economy, and not just a low emissions economy. And this is reflecting the increasing focus and policy work on adaptation in New Zealand and globally. So increasingly, and I think for quite a few, people were thinking of sort of adaptation on the left and mitigation on the right, and we think that's shifting now to where adaptation is increasingly a question of transition, and these physical risks and opportunities are obviously going to be present regardless. So we would expect these kinds of risks and opportunities to be disclosed in a way that is specific to the scheme in more detail than they appear here. So this is the general starting point, and this is moving now into a more much more specific example. So this is the Bank of England, and this is them disclosing the physical risks on the left and transition risks on the right related to their sovereign bond holdings. So on the left-hand side with the physical risks, you can see that they have, basically looking at this, and they're looking across different physical hazards arising due to climate change, and they're looking at this and basically thinking that, well, they don't think there's particularly much physical risk exposure, and also sovereign bond holdings are not a huge part of their portfolio, so relatively low and unchanged year on year. But compared to a comparable G7 portfolio, many others have higher physical risks, and this has been driven by a combination of the portfolio mix and what's in there, and also the kinds of hazards that the assets are exposed to. And this is basically a scorecard type analysis, which they're considering to be basically a first step towards assessing physical risk to the bank's sovereign bonds. And then on transition risks on the right, so this is where the Bank of England is looking to understand this, and this is an area where there's not particularly sophisticated approaches and quite a lot of new work coming through at the moment. And here they're looking at national level targets and actions towards 1.5 degrees, finding that the country level emissions reductions targets to 2030, which are embedded in basically the country's emissions reduction plans, are roughly consistent with a below 2 degrees warming scenario, but not necessarily consistent with scenarios to limit temperature to 1.5 degrees pathways. So those purple dots, so they're wanting to effectively get those risks down to the 1.5 degrees aligned pathway, and this type of analysis is helping them to understand where their holdings are at, and then informing what they may need to do in response. Okay, moving on now to the anticipated impacts and financial impacts. So this pillar is more the forward-looking aspect of the strategy section, and this is intended to inform a primary user's view of the attractiveness of the scheme or the funds as an investment option. So it's important that you bear in mind here that the information does not need to be precise and fully quantified in order to be relevant. In most cases, it can and should remain broadly expressed using ranges. And to help give a sense of the scope, so the TCFD consider that the factors affecting financial impacts from climate change includes 3 key prongs. So effectively this exposure to and the anticipated effects of those specific climate-related opportunities we talked about earlier, and also then the planned responses to manage risks or seize opportunities, and the implications of those plans on financial position, performance and cash flows. Again, we've proposed a 1-year exemption for the disclosure of the financial impact aspects of this pillar, and these are available for entities if they want to take this up. We've also, you may see this language on the end of the disclosures of reasonably expected to align with the ISSB, and recognise the degree of uncertainty involved with this type of analysis and disclosure. Okay, another example, this time from Allianz, who is a large global insurer and asset manager. So they have used a heat map type representation of the impacts of climate change on Allianz's investments. We've got here 2 degrees and a 1.5 degrees scenario. You can see how the picture changes, most easily demonstrated up the top right with the red ones coming through for higher transition risks with a more ambitious transition scenario where we get emissions down to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So this is effectively qualitative information on anticipated impacts to assets held. And this is basically top-down type qualitative exposure screening of the investment portfolio, and Allianz is also complementing this with other top-down and bottom-up analysis as well. Here we have the Aviva example, and this is where they're also starting to look at the anticipated impacts and sort of slowly building towards the financial impacts as well. And so they have used the climate value at risk methodology, and they have outputs split into different scenarios, starting at the top left there with the 1.5, 2, 3, and 4 degrees scenarios. And then on the bottom, they're starting to differentiate what kind of impacts are coming through on the physical versus the transition side. And then on the top right, starting to differentiate that in terms of different asset classes as well. The next example, so from BNY Mellon, they've illustrated here potential financial impacts of climate risk and opportunities as percentage changes in equity values with the different scenarios. And they've effectively been following the Bank of England PRA guidance, starting to get into, basically focus on equity values and investment portfolios here. So those are some examples of different ways that fund managers globally are starting to disclose in this area. And just quickly a note on confidential information. So we have heard concerns around the disclosure of confidential information. These are the concerns the TCFD's been hearing for a while. And so they put these, basically principles to bear in mind when you're making judgments in this area about making disclosure. And this particularly comes up often as a issue in respect to opportunities where people are conscious of making too detailed disclosures in this area. So we would say that, confidentiality is not a reason for avoiding disclosure, but judgment will be required as to the level of granularity that you disclose. And so in exercising that judgment, we would start with these TCFD suggested considerations and also trying to start broader and more qualitative and moving to be more specific and more quantitative over time. But disclosure should be as specific as you deem to be practically and commercially possible and should not be so broad so as to be unclear for primary users. Okay, so the fourth pillar of the strategy section is how the entity will position itself. And these are capturing the transition plan aspects of the strategy section. And this is effectively an opportunity for climate reporting entities to be communicating to primary users about how they're intending to strategically position themselves in the context of the global and domestic transition. So effectively, primary users want to see a description about how you're responding and how you positioning the schemes that are relevant to thrive in a world which is attempting to both rapidly reduce emissions and adapt to the unavoidable consequences of climate change. So we have the three prongs of this pillar of the disclosure requirements. First is the description of the current business model and strategy. So we've effectively, for MIS managers, dropped out the definitions of business model and strategy, and we'll effectively direct you to our guidance, our staff guidance on how to interpret those terms in respect of the schemes and how this standard applies to you. And we did have previously have this disclosure in a different part of the strategy section and have moved it, and it now appears here under transition plans. We did previously consult on this and receive broadly positive feedback on the on disclosing the business model and strategy, provided that it's basically a brief description, able to be cross-referenced if the information already appears elsewhere. And so, we would suggest you look at the staff guidance for how these terms apply specifically to you, but certainly the term strategy is intended to very much be focused first and foremost for you on your investment strategy, which can be found in the SIPO, but sometimes can be described in other places as well by MIS managers. And again, there is a 1 year first time adoption provision available for those that want to take it up around disclosing the transition plan aspects of your strategy. However, there is quite a lot of pressure coming on at the moment around transition plans, and we only expect this to grow. So I'll get into that a little bit more in the next couple of slides. So firstly, on the scope of transition plans, we have made an important change following the previous round of consultation that's worth drawing to your attention. So effectively, we started on the left, which was this framework laid out by the TCFD, which was to have basically a transition plan and a separate adaptation plan, and that these would be aspects of the entity's overall business strategy, but disclosed, separate from each other. And we are no longer proposing that sort of setup. And the reason for that is because, well, since the TCFD made its recommendations and we made proposals on the back of that, global standard setters and others have effectively been proposing a transition plan that brings adaptation actions within it. So we've had a range of moves from the International Sustainability Standards Board, the US Securities and Exchange Commission, along those lines. And then in New Zealand, we've also had the Climate Leaders Coalition, which is basically a voluntary initiative, and they've updated their member statement to bring mitigation and adaptation within one plan. And we also received some feedback with concern around if we were going to leave adaptation separate and potentially give longer lead-in time for the disclosure of adaptation plans, and this would see them to be deprioritized and not seen as integrated or as important as the mitigation challenge of climate. And so we think that by bringing them together with this more integrated picture on the right and a more holistic definition and scope, this helps to ensure that entities can think of this and disclose in a more integrated way. And so that's an important change in scope and definition to be aware of. And I sort of touched on this already. So the reason for this is what's moving globally with these proposed standards. Also, very busy picture in terms of guidance that's already available for you and for other organizations on transition plans. And, transition plans themselves very much emerged following a concern about, lack of detail underneath firm and asset manager commitments and targets to net zero emissions. And, that's really how we got here. And so the guidance coming through from the TCFD, Investor Group on Climate Change, GFANS for financial institutions, is really trying to lay out, consistent and comparable frameworks for the disclosure of what kinds of actions are you going to take that will actually achieve those ambitious emissions reductions that are implicit in a net zero target. And then on the right-hand side, as I mentioned, the Climate Leaders Coalition, a relevant voluntary commitment, but also the New Zealand Investor Coalition for Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, and the UN convened Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, which include their own set of requirements that have been basically voluntarily agreed for components of transition plans. This is where most who are already developing these are starting with. So we're hoping to build from that without competing with those requirements. So here's an example of one of these kinds of frameworks that's sitting in guidance from GFANS, designed for financial institutions. And you can start to see it is quite a lot of work to put a transition plan together that's considered to be credible on a global stage. And I would note here that these kinds of frameworks are very much emissions centric, without including adaptation necessarily. And so, we would suggest that, and we've in our guidance pointed to these kinds of frameworks as a starting point to get your head around what's necessary as part of a transition plan. But we do expect globally and ourselves, as we do more work on guidance in this area, that adaptation will also start to come into the picture more and more, even if there's a strong sort of focus and weighting on the need to be reducing emissions. So, as I mentioned, this is a lot of work to put these together, so it shouldn't really be underestimated. That's why we've given an extra year for the, first-time adoption provision being available before there's a requirement to disclose. So we'd certainly suggest having a close look at existing guidance and getting your heads around the scope of these. So a couple of asset owner, asset manager examples of transition plans, again, using Aviva. They have effectively on the far right there, ambitious climate related targets to get to net zero as a company and as on the investment side as well. And you can see a lot of this, at least in relation to the investment side, coming through in the earlier parts of this plan through engagement, then building up to basically disengagement through to divestment, and then also new investment into low carbon strategies and climate transition funds, renewable energies and the like. And their first iteration came out earlier this year, and they were quite explicit about wanting to refresh and strengthen this plan over time. And, they very much acknowledge that, particularly, and also think with their insurance hat on, that many pieces of the puzzle are still missing. So the data is imperfect, the methodologies are incomplete, and they know that these are moving quickly, but, they don't think that they can wait for all of those to be made to be perfect before they set out a transition plan. And they've effectively said that's why they're going to take a more adaptive approach to this plan, which acknowledging it's going to change over time. And that's, effectively the challenge of climate change, is that we can't wait for data and information to become perfect. We need to move, and we need to also be improving the data and information as we go. So here's the Mercer example. So for those who joined our deep dives as part of our last consultation round, we had Ronan McCabe from Mercer New Zealand present to us directly on what Mercer was doing in this area. So there's a link there to our YouTube channel, so you can look at that again for those who are interested and may have missed it. So he effectively talked through the way that they're thinking about transition planning, and so he uses example of a company A and company B, noting that, well, if company A has higher emissions, maybe a few years ago, you'd expect to see them move away from that company towards companies with lower emissions, but effectively they're moving to a view where it's company A may have higher emissions than company B, but company A has a transition plan or a higher quality transition plan than B, and so they'd prefer to hold company A over company B. So it's a combination now of information about the company's emissions and their transition plans that they're now looking at, which is becoming a richer picture for them. And then in addition to some of the proprietary tools for analysis, this is the sort of strategic asset allocation view, and Ronan talked through his example of listed infrastructure. So you can see that showing up in the real assets in the purple in the bottom left, sort of not too large there, but in about the middle of that bottom left wedge for asset allocation, and that is pretty small weight in the portfolio. But then over on the right hand side, on the top right there, you have listed infrastructure coming through there as about a quarter of their emissions. So obviously quite large from an emissions carbon intensity perspective, and that's why they're starting to look at these kinds of issues in the portfolio from a strategic asset allocation point of view, and question really why would they have this asset class in their portfolio? Does it provide enough from a risk and return point of view to justify keeping it in? And again, Ronan noted this preference then with these kinds of issues that they're identifying to then start with engagement rather than moving straight to a divestment type strategy. And these are the kinds of actions that are making up their transition plan. So integration of climate on the top, then active ownership, things like voting and engagement for their material holdings, investment in solutions and screening. And effectively the conclusion being that Mercer believes their transition plan is about improving the returns for their clients in the long term, given that they see climate as a systemic risk, and because basic investment management is all about managing risk through an investment lens, these are steps that they think are quite central to improving their returns for their clients.
Thank you, Jack. That was an excellent run through. Yeah, as Jack said earlier, there is a lot in that section, so we hope that that was really useful. We have a really good question here, which says, how could a multi-country, multi-security fund possibly determine physical and transition impacts, and how could we undertake scenario analysis?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I mean, we definitely acknowledge that it is difficult for asset managers to get a really strong handle on physical risk and opportunities because, the scope is or can be global, covering different asset classes, different jurisdictions, and so that universe of possibilities very broad to start with, but entities are getting on top of it with different, quite varied approaches to how they're going about both scenario analysis and physical and transition risk analysis, and so effectively the requirement in New Zealand is, you disclose where you're at, and so perhaps, and Steph will talk to this a bit later in the guidance, perhaps you haven't covered the full picture for what are the, relevant schemes in New Zealand, and you will need to be quite clear about, what the boundaries of the analysis that you've done are, and then obviously primary users are going to be using that to inform their decisions about where they go, and their level of comfort with, MIS managers who are maybe going deep on certain asset classes and leaving others unexplored, or others who have more holistic approaches, but who may be going kind of lighter touch, and that, that's effectively as far as we think, fund managers can go, and they'll need to make choices about, their approach in this area. So we'd really just encourage everyone to get on the journey.
And we have a question which asks, about disclosures around management and assessment of climate risks. Is this at the scheme level or at the overall manager level?
Can I leave that for Steph in the risk management section? Yeah, I think he may have the answer for us.
Sure, but as a general, it's a general note, the legislation is very clear that disclosures are about in respect of the investment scheme. So to reiterate that point, the disclosures are not focusing on the MIS manager as an entity. They really are focusing on the scheme level. So as a default position, we would be saying probably look at the scheme, but we'll come back to Steph on that one as well. At the moment, current isn't defined as a period, which means you may lose some comparability. Would you consider defining current as being in the current reporting period?
It's a good question, yeah. So current definitely is intended to capture the current reporting period. One thing we would say is that, particularly for MIS managers, getting a sense of that current may be quite difficult to do, and you may look at your basic current financial position and performance and your current scheme and the funds within the scheme, and effectively come to the view that there's no current impacts of climate change, or that those are too uncertain to start to quantify. So we do think that's an emerging area globally in terms of disclosure. It's one of the more novel and less areas where we're seeing the least disclosure under a voluntary regime. So yes, we would definitely say current is intended to get at the the current financial statements, which ends up being the past 12 months. However, if it's useful to start to tell the story to primary users and to start to identify these types of impacts, you may find that you need to look back further into the past, if that's possible for you. And that's certainly something that we're seeing some in the corporate space undertake, and say with insurers, with Aviva there, they're looking back to 2017 and reporting on insured losses back to 2017 as part of their sort of view of current. So that may help, but yeah, the current is intended to be the current year.
Thank you. And here's a question, which is, there is a constant mention of primary users and what they want. How have you determined what they want? This is important, as you clearly are relying greatly on what you perceive primary users want. Now, I'll start answering that question, and Jack, you might want to weigh in. The primary user definition is existing and potential investors, lenders, and other creditors, and it is your primary users. So we're very, very clear that entities, so in this case, MIS managers, in respect of their scheme, must understand who the existing and potential investors and lenders and other creditors are of those schemes and what it is that they're looking to be disclosed. So we would expect, pretty good information flow towards your primary users about what types of information they were looking to have disclosed. This relates, for example, also to the presentation of the disclosures. So are you presenting it in a way that is useful for them, in a location that's useful for them? It really is a very primary user specific disclosure regime, and we are looking for engagement, with your primary user, because you can't just imagine what it is that a mythical primary user might want and disclose according to that. I think, we would expect to see that you are really engaging with your primary users and what it is that they're looking for. Anything else you want to add on that one, Jack?
I can see Lisa's smiley face. Lisa?
Excellent.
I was just going to say that obviously we've looked to the TCFD recommendations, which had a lot of work put into them as to those bits of information that were considered material to primary users, and they did a lot of work year on year going back to the users and informing those disclosures. So I thought I'd just add that to the...
Thank you. And we've got a question. If a manager of an MIS does not believe climate change risks are an issue, can their disclosure read something along the lines of, we do not incorporate climate change risks and opportunities in any of our investment decisions? Now, if that is what they do, then absolutely they would disclose that. The point of the disclosures is to share with primary users what you are actually doing. You would not want to be disclosing, something that you weren't doing. However, we would expect primary users to be pretty quickly for saying that might not be of the standard that they would expect in terms of the operation of their scheme. But no, the disclosure is very much about a disclosure of what the entity is doing. Right, we've got a couple more questions I think we'll get to you with Jack. So it's quite a long one. The focus of climate risk exposure seems to be heavily on mitigation, GHG screening, carbon intensity, but little mention of heat mapping investment portfolios for physical climate risk exposure and resilience, i.e. investment in equities like Toyota and consideration of its exposure to location of, i.e. CATL factories in Sichuan, exposure to drought and associated energy insecurity / factory closure, which has had a material impact on Toyota earnings and therefore on the investment portfolio. Should this be considered as an approach, i.e. heat mapping investment portfolios for physical risk exposure?
Yeah, fantastic question. Very detailed. I enjoyed that one. Absolutely, yes. So some of the examples we showed were more transition risk specific. We're certainly not trying to suggest that you should not be thinking about the physical risk side. We would encourage you to start with both very much on the table from the outset. It has emerged a wee bit globally that some will do transition and maybe keep kicking the can a little bit down the road on the physical side and maybe assume that it's a long-term issue that's not necessarily within your investment time horizons. We would absolutely suggest to start with both on the table, but you do have to work it through with your own processes and in your own context about where you're going to spend your time and energy and resources, because in that kind of Toyota example, that may be the case. Toyota may be in your holdings, but in the context of the rest of the fund and scheme, that needs to be judgment that the MIS managers made about, going basically deep and specific. But absolutely, we would encourage everyone to start with physical and transition risks, both within the purview of the starting point. Start qualitative and then get more quantitative over time.
Thanks. And we've got a question again about the relationship to the schemes, managers, funds, etc. So financial planning and capital deployment at a scheme level can relate to the deployment of scheme assets, i.e. portfolio construction and application. Do you mean the capital deployment and financial planning of the manager rather than the scheme?
Yeah, I mean, I think we would encourage everyone, and we're hoping this is coming through clearly in our guidance, but appreciate further feedback on this, is that you need to read, effectively all of the disclosure requirements in respect of the scheme. So that the question becomes, well, is it relevant to the scheme, or is it sort of fallen out of scope of it being about the scheme anymore? So, we would anticipate that, and we do think this is where, I guess, the upfront rider from Amelia was that scope boundary can be very hard to draw and keep rigid throughout this meeting this whole regime. And so you may find it easier to sort of relax it a bit, at least when you're going through the process of getting on top of climate-related risk and opportunity before you start to disclose, so that, yes, when you come to things like capital deployment, we could be seeing things that are specifically in respect to the scheme, but then could also be seeing things at a broader entity level, like having to actually deploy and hire climate specialists, investment manager, specialists who are climate experts, things like new tools, like what Mercer's been investing in for some time. So, the disclosures only relate to in respect of the scheme, but actually following that through as a process for how you get there is going to be tricky. So we'd suggest thinking about, starting more holistically, using the TCFD guidance and existing international examples of fund managers who have done this. And then once you've done that work, you can sort of hone in a bit on what's relevant in respect to the scheme from there. Hopefully that's clear as an answer.
Thanks, Jack. And I think this is a good question too. How do you expect primary users to make effective and accurate comparisons across schemes when there is quite a lot of wiggle room in terms of setting strategies?
Absolutely, yes. We think this, it's just a good point, which is that trying to compare one fund with another or one scheme with another in this area is it's not easy by any stretch of the imagination. And we do think that having reviewed a large number of asset manager examples globally, there's a real difference in how asset managers are approaching this issue and how they're trying to position themselves as better managing climate risk than their peer MIS managers. And so I guess in New Zealand so far, we haven't seen the same degree of sort of strategic positioning and competition on that just yet. And we can't sort of preempt that too much. But, I guess we would suggest by having a look globally at how, fund managers are effectively competing over this idea that they are better managing climate-related risk and opportunities for their clients than other fund managers. And if, really it boils down to the question of, well, how systemic and how material do you think climate risk is? And that's an area where different primary users may have different views about, just how disruptive climate change is going to be.
Thanks, Jack. And a couple of quick questions that we can deal with, which is there currently a MIS sector working group designing scenario analysis? So this question might have come through before you mentioned it. Yes, there is. If you want to know more about it, please just email the team, climate@xrb.govt.nz, and we can put you in touch with the people in charge of that. And then, will there be any regulatory body that ensures that MIS managers are affecting the transition plans as described in the disclosures? Now, the FMA is the regulatory body overseeing the climate-related disclosure regime. There are also very important requirements in New Zealand under fair trading, advertising standards, etc. So there's a lot out there that we would expect to users may be able to think about if they're not sure about whether or not a company is actually affecting the transition plan that they're working on. But our, a key message would be very much, you should be disclosing the things that you are actually doing. We do not want to see disclosure of anything that an entity is not actively carrying out in their entity. And Nz Cs2 has the overarching principle of fair presentation. It should be a fair presentation of what is going on. All right, so I think we might pause there on strategy questions. Thanks very much, Jack. Off the hook for a little bit now. So over to Steph to talk us through risk management.
Excellent, thanks, Amelia. Let's take a look at the proposed risk management disclosures now. The objective of the risk management disclosures is to enable primary users to understand how an entity's climate-related risks are identified, assessed, and managed, and how these climate-related risk processes are integrated into existing risk management processes. So primary users globally are looking for entities to have robust risk management processes in place. So it's important to note that these disclosures are focused on the processes involved in climate-related risk analysis rather than the outcomes of that analysis. So the section contains two overarching disclosure requirements. The first of those, disclosure 17A, has 5 proposed sub-disclosure requirements. These are the tools and methods that an entity has used. These are a significant contributing factor for primary users in determining whether an entity has identified and assessed climate-related risks robustly. Examples of tools entities might employ include scenario analysis, investor engagement, and economic modelling. The time horizons considered, a coherent approach to the timeframes cited here and in the strategy section will be helpful. The value chain, Lisa's Nz Cs2 contains a general requirement that an entity must consider the exposure of its value chain when considering its exposure to climate-related risks and opportunities. And following some feedback from the earlier GRM consultation, the Xrb board has amended the standard to require disclosure of whether any parts of the value chain are excluded. The next is the frequency of assessment, and finally prioritisation relative to other risks, involving disclosure of the method or approach taken to prioritise climate-related risks, which combine disclosures from earlier proposals. So it's worth noting that we deleted an earlier proposed disclosure on how an entity makes disclosure decisions to mitigate, transfer, accept or control those climate-related risks. So onto a quick example, referring here to a disclosure of climate-related risk management on the part of a US asset manager, T. Rowe Price. This disclosure, which we reiterate was developed in response to the voluntary recommendations of the TCFD rather than the mandatory standard Nz Cs2, states that climate risks and opportunities are key considerations across the firm, feeding into the deliberations of their enterprise risk group, driving investment research on climate change, and triggering engagement with existing and prospective investees to better understand both their level of climate-related risk exposure and the investees' capacity to provide robust data. T. Rowe Price are also keenly aware of the role that market sentiment can play in determining uptake of the investment products that they're offering. So their disclosure explains this by setting out that their product group produces annual and 3-year roadmaps of investment products, which an investment management steering committee is then responsible for reviewing and approving. Now that committee is chaired by the group CIO and the head of investments, and it includes a head of each of the investment business units, and that's US equity, international equity, fixed income, and multi-asset, and also the heads of distribution and the COO. So it's quite a high-powered group. And part of that approval process involves the committee seeking the advice of an in-house ESG task force regarding the impact of climate-related risks and opportunities on the commercial appeal of the product range. The second overarching disclosure requires an entity to describe how climate-related risk identification, assessment, and management is integrated within existing process practices. Now, BNY Mellon provide an example of the disclosure of risk management integration. And again, the caveats apply with respect to voluntary versus mandatory disclosure practices. So BNY Mellon tackle climate-related risk via their enterprise risk management framework, the activities of which are all fairly consistent with typical risk management practices, such as establishing risk appetite statements, considering risk across strategic, credit, market, liquidity, operational, and model risk categories, employing a 3 lines of defense approach to risk management, which includes internal audit, and utilizing stress testing and scenario analysis. So steps that BNY and Mellon are taking to adapt their ERM activities to integrate climate-related risks include adjusting the time horizons outward, employing qualitative and quantitative credit risk management materiality screening, and incorporating climate change as a risk driver across different capital stress scenarios. So for example, climate was taken into account through their comprehensive capital analysis review wargaming process. So BNY Mellon's efforts to integrate climate into their existing ERM framework highlights the key point that climate poses additional considerations that traditional risk management processes and approaches may not yet address. So this is the TCFD's table, and it talks about the characteristics of climate-related risk. Now, in particular, novelty, non-linear dynamics, and the complex systemic effects of climate change will likely require new approaches to risk management that entities may not yet be really fully familiar with or have engaged with.
Okay, thanks, Steph. So we'll go back to that question, which is disclosure around management and assessment of climate risk. Is this at the scheme level or at the overall manager level?
Thank you, and Jack, you did to me, just to be clear about that. Disclosures have to be focused first and foremost on the scheme, but we would really strongly encourage anything that sensibly makes it clear, makes that narrative clearer to your primary user of how these things work. If you can refer to the manager, the role of the manager, the role of the corporate entity, I think that would be helpful. It would be helpful for you in completing the disclosure as well.
Okay, now we don't have any other specific questions on risk. I think those are some great examples. If you do have a question that you want to put to the team on the risk management disclosures, put them in the chat and we'll get them to them later on in the presentation, or we can get to them afterwards. Oh, hold on, someone's come through. Where there is a fund manager who employs multiple managers who have their own risk processes, could disclosures be at the scheme level, or would detail need to go down to a lower level?
We're a fund manager with multiple managers who have their own risk. I think there has to be a bit of a pass-through process there. If it's material to the scheme level, then there has to be some degree of disclosure of what's taking place within those various different managers that are Subdr. Jack,
yeah, I'd say absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So if you, it's really important that fund managers, MAS managers look at the legislation here. There is a requirement for disclosure at fund by fund level. So if there is anything specific that's happening at the fund level that a primary user needs to know about, that should absolutely be disclosed, because the key thing here is that, you know, the primary users are investing into the fund. They really need to know what is happening at that fund. So if there is anything that is happening, if a manager of a particular fund has its own risk process, then absolutely that would be a disclosure that we would expect to see happening at a fund level. If there are risk management processes, as Lisa mentioned earlier, that are across the scheme, then they can be disclosed at a scheme level. But yeah, so it's very much about making sure the disclosures are at the level of the funds that the individuals or the entities other entities are investing in. Hope that helped answer that one. Okay, so we will move on now to, gone back to metrics and targets, and over to you, Judy.
Ngā mihi, Amelia, tēnā koutou. Metrics and targets is where greenhouse gas emissions are disclosed, as well as your other metrics and targets. And assurance is required over these greenhouse gas emission disclosures from October 2024 onwards. The objective for disclosing the metrics and targets information is to allow your primary users to better assess your potential risk-adjusted returns, general exposure to climate-related issues, and progress or managing or adapting to those issues. These disclosures should be about describing the metrics and targets that are used to manage your climate-related risks and opportunities. They should inform and be informed by your governance, strategy and risk management processes, and create a feedback loop over time in the same way that other key performance indicators and key risk indicators are used to inform your management processes. The proposals require disclosure of cross-industry metrics. These are considered to be relevant to all businesses, regardless of their industry and business model, and I'll go into those in a bit more detail shortly. The proposals also require disclosure of your relevant industry-based metrics. We are not proposing to specify what these metrics should be. You can choose the industry metrics which you want to use. You might want to consider the industry-based metrics from the International Sustainability Standards Board. They have picked up the SASB standards and are looking to adapt these, or you can choose some from the Glasgow Financial Alliance. Whatever works, that is how you're measuring your performance. That's the stuff you should disclose. In addition, if you use metrics for measuring and managing your climate-related performance that fit neither of those categories, you should disclose them. So disclose all your metrics. The proposals also require disclosure of the targets that you are using to measure and manage your climate-related risks and opportunities and the performance against these. And I'll go into a bit more detail on those as well. We've tried to keep these disclosures fairly principles-based to provide flexibility along with prescriptive disclosures where we're trying to provide some comparability with the cross-industry metric categories. And just to note, if there is disclosures here that you believe are immaterial for your primary users, then you don't have to make them. So the proposals, there are 3 time horizons that are relevant to climate-related metrics: current, historical and forward-looking. And to that question before, current most recent reporting period would be typically what we would expect and probably covers the same period as your financial statements. Historical is data for those earlier periods, and in Nz Cs2 we're proposing that you would disclose 2 years of historic data in the form of comparatives. And future-looking is future period data covering the short, medium and long-term time horizons. So your forward metrics could be based on methodologies such as scenario analysis, trend analysis, sensitivity analysis and simulations, as well as commitments and climate-related targets. Your forward-looking metrics might be more appropriately reported as a range based on assumptions about the future state of the world, which you could tie to one or more plausible climate scenarios. And it's helpful to disclose, if possible, your climate-related metrics consistently from year to year to facilitate comparative and trend analysis, although we do recognise this is a developing area and so you can change and you may develop better metrics over time. So 8 cross-industry metric categories. As I said before, they are expected to be relevant to all businesses regardless of their industry and business model. And just note that they are categories, so there's flexibility in how you interpret these for your entity. Again, there's 2 years of comparatives. So we do have some optional exemptions there where you can disclose no comparatives in the first year and only 1 year in the second. So that sort of runs with the thing, and an exemption for the disclosing the analysis of your trends. Next, I want to run through the detailed requirements for the greenhouse gas emissions disclosures, which have been the most common disclosures we've seen to date. So our proposals are for the disclosure of gross greenhouse gas emissions and including scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3. For an MIS manager reporting in respect of their scheme, the scheme itself is unlikely to have scope 1 and 2 emissions because these activities are unlikely to be carried out by the scheme, in which case scope 1 is 0, scope 2 is 0, and then you're looking at your scope 3. So the full value chain is your scope 3, and you might find that the services provided to support the operation of the scheme therefore come in as scope 3. We would refer you to the PCAF standard for the emissions, the financed emissions section, and then the GHG protocol scope 3 and corporate standards for the remaining 2 areas. There are some additional requirements around the proposed greenhouse gas emissions disclosures. We've recognised that this is not a measurement standard, it's a disclosure standard, and that there are globally accepted and commonly used greenhouse gas emissions measurement and reporting standards, including Greenhouse Gas Protocol, ISO, and others developing for specific areas such as the PCAF standard. We aren't proposing to mandate the approach that you must use, but you need to disclose what standards you have used. Again, consolidation approach, not so relevant probably for MIS managers. Everything's probably going to be in your scope 3, but you will be looking to disclose likely using equity share for your scope 3 emissions, and then the specific exclusions. This is really important. We recognise that some areas there's no methodology, no data available, and under the GHG protocol scope 3 standard, you must disclose specific exclusions with a justification of why. And this is important when we get to the assurance regime, because they'll be looking to see why and how you've excluded things. We've also given an optional 1-year exemption for the disclosure of Scope 3 emissions. And again, we recognise this is a difficult area, but it does really help with informing your transition planning and getting a good grip there. So we encourage you to get started as soon as possible and recognising that there are data gaps. And one final point, there are proposed requirements in Nz Cs2 for the disclosure of methodologies, assumptions and uncertainty in relation to these greenhouse gas emissions. This is particularly important when it comes to those Scope 3, as there's generally a greater level of uncertainty associated with these, and your results might differ depending on which methodology you've used. The data availability and analytical methodologies are rapidly evolving, and we expect the direction of travel for emissions reductions is as important as that tiny little accuracy. So just a reminder of Scope 3, this is the full value upstream and downstream, the yellow arrows shown on the slide. So for an MIS manager or the scheme under their management, the most significant source of emissions is those investments, which are that top of the arrow on the right there. And why are we so, oops, Amelia's having a meltdown with the slides there. Back a bit, back, there we go. Whoop. Oh, one more. Thank you. Why is it so important to include Scope 3? For most entities, this is where the significant emissions risks and opportunities lie, and clearly for financed emissions, that's where the schemes are. The CDP Financial Services Disclosure Report looked at financed emissions being 700 times larger than any operational emissions. As a scheme, you don't have any operational emissions anyway, but these are significant sources of emissions that are being facilitated. And basically, to achieve net zero by 2050, we need a whole of economy transition. Every company, every bank, every insurer, and every investor will need to adjust their business models and develop credible plans for the transition and implement them. Private finance will fund the initiative and innovation of these plans, provided it has the necessary information, tools, and market. So this is about getting that information out there. Financial firms will need to review more than the emissions generated. They need to report the financed emissions generated by companies, properties, and projects to which they lend. So the following examples have been sourced from a number of materials, and again, that caveat that they are made under a voluntary regime. They're not disclosures for the purposes of our standard, but they might be example. I haven't given any greenhouse gas basic emissions disclosures, so I think everyone probably understands what they look like. This is an intensity metric. This is BlackRock looking at the average carbon intensity of the underlying markets for those standard portfolios. So intensity ratios, greenhouse gas impact per unit of physical or unit of economic activity. And examples of intensity ratios that might be used: weighted average carbon intensity of your investment portfolio, weighted average carbon intensity of your insurance premiums, the physical emissions intensity for each investment portfolio, or the economic emissions intensity for each investment portfolio, rather than emissions portfolio. The next one, the transition metric. This disclosure allows users to better understand the potential financial vulnerability regarding issues such as possible impairment or stranding of assets, effects on the value of assets and liabilities, and changes in demand for products and services. So when thinking about vulnerability to climate-related transition risks, we're talking about policy and legal risks, technology risk as emerging technologies impact the competitiveness of certain entities, market risk from changes to supply and demand, and reputational risk tied to changing customer and community preferences. So some example metrics here: concentration of credit exposure to fossil fuel related assets, percent of investments in the fossil fuel sector, percentage of investments subject to direct ETS emissions trading scheme liabilities, so on, so forth. The physical risk allows users to better understand the potential financial vulnerability regarding issues such as impairment or stranding of assets, effects on the value of assets and liabilities, and costs of business interruptions. So when you're thinking about your investees, you need to consider both acute risks such as storms, floods and wildfires, and chronic risks as higher temperatures and sea level rise that refer to those longer term shifts in climate patterns. So someone's point about Toyota earlier, the physical risk will be specific to the geography where those assets or activities are located and their likely exposure or vulnerability to the risk. So some examples of metrics: number and value of mortgage loans in 100-year flood zones, proportion of property, infrastructure or other alternate asset portfolios in a geography subject to flooding, heat stress or water stress, or portion of real assets invested in which are exposed to 1 in 100 or 1 in 200 climate related hazards. This disclosure on climate-related opportunities provides insight into the position of entities relative to their peers and allows users to understand likely transition pathways and potential changes in revenue and profitability over time. So looking at things like improved resource efficiency, energy sources, development of new products and services, access to new markets, and improved adaptive capacity and resilience. So some example metrics in this category: percentage of investments related to energy efficiency and low emissions technology, the percentage of investments in products or services that support the transition to low emissions economy, or the percentage of investments in climate resilient geographies or sectors. And you can see this one from the Macquarie Group. This is the Goldman Sachs example on the capital deployment. So this disclosure is around having where you're deploying your capital to manage risks and increase your opportunities. So it gives an indication to the extent to which the long-term value might be affected. You can think about the capital invested, deployed or committed to green and transition aligned activities, or towards climate solution businesses and projects, or showing the proportion of loans, capital, insurance written on green assets. And if you were doing those, any of those things, you would want to describe how you've defined green assets, or preferably pick up someone else's taxonomy. And it can be helpful to present your investments in traditional products alongside low emissions products so they can understand the scale of the investment in the different types of activities. Internal emissions pricing is a mechanism by which entities can put a value on their greenhouse gas emissions to facilitate an analysis of actual and potential impacts of climate-related risks and opportunities. So it can help you understand which entities you invest in that have business models that are vulnerable to future policy responses and who's adapting. You can use this metric to help inform your internal decision making, and you can basically define these how you like, but we would suggest you would tag them to the someone else's forward-looking price if you can, but these can help you decide where and how your what your strategy should look like. And then one final area around remuneration policies. So this is likely to be for the how people that are managing the scheme are remunerated, incentivized to provide the right outcomes. And this one is from HSBC, where they've just talked about their weighting for targets aligned with their climate ambitions. So these are important incentives for basically making sure that you encourage the people providing management services to achieve your goals and objectives. The final disclosures under the metrics and targets are in relation to your targets, and these targets refer to specific level, threshold, quantity or qualitative goal that you want to meet over a defined time horizon to address your climate related risks and opportunities. So these targets should be aligned with your strategy and risk management goals. They should be linked to the metrics that you're disclosing, and they should be quantified and measurable. They should identify the base year against which you'll track progress. And timeframe of targets should be coherent across all targets and your strategy, and if feasible, consistent with key dates tracked by international organisations such as the IPCC or regulators. The interim target is a checkpoint between the current period and your target end date, which you can use to assess your progress and make adjustments to your plans and targets, but like the Aviva example we saw earlier. Any medium and long-term targets should ideally have interim targets set to covering their full, medium and long-term target horizon. The disclosures of the targets should be sort of supported by contextual narrative information on items such as the organisational boundaries, the methodologies and the underlying data and assumptions. And we have included proposed requirements to disclose if your greenhouse gas emissions targets are aligned with science and if you are relying on offsets to achieve those. So this is an example cited by the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero in their recommendations and guidance. And it's from the Italian banking group Intesa Sanpaolo in their business plan released in February this year. This disclosure communicates its 2030 financed emissions reduction interim targets for 4 priority high emitting sectors. And it's also disclosed that its 2030 emission reduction targets cover more than 60% of the non-financial corporates portfolio of financed emissions. The proposal is that an entity discloses the targets that it uses, and many entities will have experience setting targets for gross emission reductions or emission intensity reductions, as shown in the top box here. The Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero suggested an additional 2 categories of targets which could be used. These are not required, so this is just more information, background that might be useful. So real economy transition targets are focused on real economy emissions reductions and climate solutions and should reflect the key approaches that you are taking. You could set targets and monitor metrics that indicate progress in implementing your net zero strategy. So some of the most common examples at present relate to engagement metrics, which can include voting metrics, outcome metrics, and more. One final thing from me here, the assurance of greenhouse gas emissions. So this is the final section of the standard. The legislation states that the greenhouse gas emissions must be assured for periods ending on or after the 27th of October 2024, and we are proposing limited assurance. So that assurance will cover the disclosed scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions, the additional requirements around the standards used, the consolidation approach and the exclusions, as well as the methodology assumption and uncertainty disclosure requirements from Nz Cs2. So Amelia, I'm dreading the questions.
Thank you, Judy. And yeah, thank you for bearing with my errant mouse clicking here. So lots of questions on emissions. So when we're talking greenhouse gas emissions, schemes would need to disclose their scope 3. Yes. Does that mean we need to disclose scope 1, 2 and 3 of the underlying investments, or just 1 and 2?
So the PCAF standard has different asset classes that they're looking at for those disclosures, and they are recommending, I think, minimum of scope 1 and 2 and scope 3 for some asset classes, and then moving to scope 3 as better data and information becomes available over time. So I am not 100% expert on the PCAF, but that's my understanding. I would certainly go and have a look at what they're saying, because that's a good place to start.
Yeah, and I would definitely think here about the disclosure requirements in Nz Cs2 about what is material to your primary user. You know, you can get into infinite levels of detail here, but the key thing is about, you know, what a level of information, you know, are you going to provide to your primary user that will help them make their decisions. And so again, that you know, understanding what your primary user wants to know, how much detail they want, that's also quite useful.
Yeah, well, just one final point there. I mean, it depends a little bit on on who you're investing in. So, for instance, if you're investing in Z Energy, they have relatively small scope 1 and 2 emissions, but their scope 3, which is the product they're selling, is massive. So you would want to definitely be putting that into your consideration in that case.
Thank you. And we had a very similar question on that, so I'll move on to a new one. For investment types not yet covered under PCAF, i.e. derivatives, what is the expectation on how these investments financed emissions will be calculated?
Yes, good question. Derivatives, stretching my financial knowledge here. So derivatives, are they just a financial product, or are they do you buy a product under derivatives? What I would suggest is these standards are rapidly developing. If there is no data and there's no possible way you could figure out how to calculate these at the moment, then I would be writing them in as an exclusion and explaining why. I think that these, as I said, these standards are rapidly developing and they're covering more asset classes all the time. So the expectation is that we will all agree on a methodology for including these things over time.
Thanks, Judy. So we've got a good question here about property investment. We have a scheme that invests in dozens of industrial properties. In turn, each industrial property has one or more tenants, sometimes hundreds of tenants, i.e. or more. We are concerned about the capability for small tenants to be able to measure and report back to use the full value chain emissions under Scope 3. In this case, could we consider smaller tenants to be an exclusion due to the inability to have them measure Scope 3 to begin with?
So I'm not sure what the PCAF says on investments in properties, that you don't always have to go down that rabbit hole of getting all of the Scope 3 of your scope, because it's your Scope 3 to start with. And so generally you're asking for Scope 1 and 2. Their most material emissions, depending on the business that they're in, is likely to be electricity use that's relevant to you in that case. That is part of the facilities that you're operating. Again, I would double check the PCAF standard, and you can exclude, under most of those standards, there are the ability to exclude minor sources of emissions, but yeah, you'll find, you may be very surprised who is and who is not measuring their emissions these days.
And one question that has come up in other deep dives is, is there any requirement as part of Aotearoa New Zealand Climate Standards to require those, the entities in your value chain to measure their emissions and give that information back to you? No, there is no requirement in the standard for that to happen. However, we absolutely do expect that information on emissions will become part of a condition of capital, or will become part of any contractual or supply chain arrangements. So we are encouraging every entity to start beginning to measure its emissions. And you, as if you have any contractual engagement with these entities, you may wish to start putting that into, for example, lease agreements. But that is absolutely your choice and is not mandated by the standard. Right, okay. What is the purpose of the management remuneration disclosure, 21H? It potentially creates a conflict of how investment managers balance financial returns versus hitting CO2 targets and how they get paid.
Well, I think the point of this disclosure is for the people investing in your fund understanding what incentives the investment managers have for achieving particular targets that is there. And this is about the disclosure of those. If there are no management incentives, then the answer is there are none. But that people are interested. They want to know, if you're putting all those beautiful targets out there, they want to know whether your managers are incentivized to achieve them or not.
All right,
same as the financial targets.
True. We have another question on remuneration. There is a requirement to use cross-industry metrics for remuneration. As there's no cross-industry metric, is there a first-year exemption on that? And then also, do you have any thoughts on what cross-industry metrics would be used for remuneration disclosure, especially as remuneration disclosures can be a statement rather than a numeric?
So again, it's up to an entity to decide. It's a category, so you can choose how you describe your remuneration disclosures. Some of them are using a percentage, that there might be a 5%, a 2%, a 1% bonus if you achieve targets. Some are saying that we've got those sorts of things. So I think, yeah, you get to choose, you get to have a look around at what's out there, and we're just trying to look at how people are incentivized to achieve the targets that they've put out there.
And importantly, again, this is about disclosure about what you're doing. If there is no remuneration target, if there is nothing related to remuneration in the way that you manage the fund, the scheme, that is what you would disclose. So that's really important. You're not, if you do not use it, you just would not disclose it, because it is about giving the primary users information on all the different entities and MIS managers and what they're doing. Right, so okay, I'm going to read this one out. Hi, Judy. The opportunities you described with the Goldman Sachs example appear to be more about financing the transition rather than the direct opportunity that the transition presents for the climate reporting entity, i.e. articulating the business case for such an investment. I would have thought the opportunity should be captured as, i.e. percentage revenue growth attributable to investments in renewable energy, as opposed to announcements about sustainable finance commitments, which feels a bit like greenwashing, i.e. how much Goldman Sachs has invested in a climate transition / inclusive growth / multi-theme.
Yep, so again, these are categories and you can define the metrics how you like. And I agree that, you know, the percentage revenue growth attributable to your investments in renewable energy would be a good metric to have. I suspect that Goldman Sachs don't have that level of sophistication yet, so they are starting with where they've put their money for now. But you can change and move. We wouldn't want you to change and move these metrics all the time, but we do recognise that people will be starting and trying to paint the picture of what they have and what they have available now, and that they may choose to describe things differently over time.
Thanks, Judy. A question again about the disclosure here. Do we need to state it's not relevant as it's a reporting requirement, or just leave it off? So, good question. Lots we can say. Firstly, please remember that this is a regulated scheme. There are very important record-keeping requirements. So if you are making a judgment that disclosure is firstly not material, you would need to have some record keeping around that decision that you've made. If you do not have remuneration related to climate change, for example, you do not need to say, I'm not disclosing this because it is not something we use in our business. You know, this is not a comply or explain scheme. However, it may be material for your primary user to understand that you don't have it. We're not going to give you the hard and fast rules about what you can and can't say. It's all about what might be material for your primary user to be able to understand what you're doing. Right. How are we going on time here? Oh, we've got a little bit of time. So I've got lots of questions. Sorry if we haven't got to them. As I said, we will answer your questions after the event. There is a plethora of different carbon metrics, standards, and methods, which also aren't audited or verified, and many companies report dubious offset programs, etc. How do you see managers dealing with poor data quality and disclosure, and are there any penalties or consequence if reported MIS metrics are incorrect?
So let me just answer the first part of that question. I might leave the penalties consequences to you, Amelia. Plethora of different carbon metric standards, agreed. Your emissions disclosures will have to be assured from the October 2024 onwards, so you will need to show good records about how you arrived at the number that you've disclosed. We are requiring gross emissions, so you need to find out the emissions of your entities before they've applied any dubious offsets, dubious or otherwise. So we're looking for the gross emissions disclosures here, primarily for that reason. Otherwise, anyone who claims they're net zero today, you would record zero, and that's not particularly helpful for understanding where the risks and opportunities lie. I think that's probably all I have to say on that. Amelia, did you want to answer the consequences?
Yeah, again, a reminder, this is a regulated scheme. We know the FMA are putting out, they've got some new information on their website. They will be putting out more information on their compliance expectations as time goes on. Very important that it is about disclosing what it is that you're doing, and that you do have the records that you are keeping internally to back that up. So we'll just move on got a little bit more to go. I will pass over to Steph just to give you a bit of information about the MIS specific guidance.
Cool. Okay, thanks, Amelia. So let's start with a quick overview of the Xrb staff guidance documents that you can call on now or expect to see in the future. We've previously published sectoral scenario analysis guidance, fact sheets on scenario analysis and measuring your emissions, and a director's preparation guide. All of that is available from the resources section on the Xrb website. In July, we published guidance for all sectors and sector-specific guidance for MIS managers. We also have sector-specific guidance for banks and insurers in development. along with some targeted guidance for scenario analysis at entity level and for transition planning. But what we want to focus on today are the two documents that were published in July, along with the exposure draft. As has been handily pointed out by quite a few people to date, so a big shout out to Oliver and Bex on that in particular, that these guidance documents, they're live, they're working drafts, so we're very keen to have your feedback on them. So I'll now go on to explain a little bit about our approach to the development of the guidance, its structure and the nature of its content. So we set about the process of guidance development with three core objectives. Our first objective is to deepen understanding of climate-related risk and opportunity. The regime isn't about tick box compliance, it's about improving the information available to investors, and in doing so, improving the resilience of the disclosing entities to climate-related risk. Our second objective is to illustrate primary user needs. We've tried to illustrate as clearly as possible for preparers what the needs of primary users are. We're hoping that the information will help to clarify how preparers could approach disclosure in the most useful way. And it's probably worth, at this point, just picking up that excellent question, how do you interpret primary user needs? And it's a really valid point. And what we've done so far in that respect is to try to understand what's happening in terms of TCFD surveys of primary user impressions of disclosures to date. We've looked at disclosures that have been out there. We've had submissions, we've had feedback, we've had direct discussions with people as a result of our disclosure exposure drafts and previous consultations. But obviously that is a limited pool and it will grow over time as the regime beds in. So there has to be some degree of interpretive function of trying to understand what primary user needs may be. So hopefully that will improve and grow over time. Now, the final aim, we're trying to build consistency. We're aiming to do that primarily via enhancing preparers' understanding, both of climate-related risk and opportunity and primary user needs, but also through building transparency and coherence in the methods and approaches that we're describing. So this is an example of the guidance accompanying Disclosure 13B regarding climate-related risks and opportunities. So it opens with an explanation of that primary user perspective, then describes an approach that can be taken to the disclosure, signals that first-time adoption relief is available, and highlights some useful external resources. And then finally, that provides an illustration of how entities could disclose. So this is the typical structure and content of the guidance document. So please let us know what you make of it and what, if anything, you'd like to see done differently as we continue to develop these and other guidance documents.
Thank you, Steph. All right, let's see if we have got some questions on guidance. No, but we've got some excellent input from Jenica, who is the manager of climate-related disclosures at the FMA, on what legislation there is that people might need to know and what the directives consequences are. So thank you very much. I will just, there are a couple of questions that I've saved to the end to see if we had time. So we had a question about double materiality. Why is it not in the Xrb Climate Standards? So firstly, I would encourage you to go have a watch of the deep dive on Nz Cs2, where we talked a lot about materiality. It's a very important principle there. So we, as you will read in the basis for conclusions of Nz Cs3, we do not consider that these labels of single or double materiality are particularly helpful. We do have those very important disclosure requirements in the materiality section on Nz Cs3 about thinking broadly about feedback loops, about an entity, in this case a scheme's impact out on the climate, and what in terms of that might come back in terms of any transition risks. So here we might have some reputational risks. So really please do have a look at those disclosure requirements in Nz Cs3. They're very, very important, and that basis for conclusions should help understand where the Xrb board has got to on double materiality. And then Judy, I'm just going to ask you one more question. How can metrics be comparable if they're calculated differently, particularly for things like carbon intensity relative to revenue, capex, opex, etc.?
Yep, good point. So this is why the disclosure of the methodologies and assumptions is really important, because then you can see where they are the same and where they are different. The reason that people manage their businesses differently, so we don't want to say you must do things this way. We are pushing people towards recognised standards, recognised calculations where possible. But if the Nz Cs2 requires you to disclose your methodologies and assumptions, which should help with that understanding of how things can be compared or not. And in fact, Scope 3 emissions are never able to be compared across entities anyway. So there's a limit to comparability in some of these spaces.
Thanks, Judy. Right, I will just finish off by saying, please a reminder that these are exposure drafts. We are super keen to get your feedback. So in the main consultation document, which is on the Xrb website, we have 6 main consultation questions, and they focus on things like the primary user needs, the practicality of preparing the required disclosures, first-time adoption provisions, and the draft of staff guidance. And we very much want your feedback so that we can improve the standards before they are issued. Now, the consultation closes on the 26th of September, and we need submissions in by this date so that we are able to issue the final standards by December. Thank you very much for all the questions that we have had throughout this presentation. We will have taken all of those on board, and as I said, questions that we didn't get to today, we will come back to you with answers to those. We've got all the other deep dive presentations. This deep dive presentation and the accompanying slides will go up on our website, and we're really, really keen to get your feedback. So you can email us, you can submit on our website, you can comment on our LinkedIn page, or you can get in touch in any other way. We're very, very keen to hear your views as we develop the final disclosure requirements over the next few months. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you to the team for presenting and putting up with my crazy mouse. We're really happy that you were able to join us, and we will look forward to getting your comments. Ka kite anō.